On January 6, 2011, Defense Secretary Robert Gates stood behind a podium at the Pentagon and killed a machine that had never fired a shot. The Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, 36 tons, built to launch from a ship 25 miles offshore, skim across open ocean at speeds no armored vehicle had ever reached, then climb onto a beach and fight like a tank. 27 years in development, $3 billion spent, not one delivered to a single Marine. The math was almost impossible to say out loud. A vehicle designed to outrun anti-ship missiles had been outrun by its own price tag. A machine engineered to solve the deadliest problem in amphibious warfare had become instead one line in a budget briefing, canceled in front of reporters in under a minute after nearly 3 decades of work. The strangest part was not that it failed. Weapons programs fail constantly, quietly, and get buried in appendices. No one reads. The strange part was who agreed to bury this one. Not a senator hunting for headlines. Not an auditor with a grudge. The man who stood up days later and said the Marine Corps supported the cancellation was the Commandant of the Marine Corps himself, the officer whose own troops needed this vehicle most. To understand how the fastest amphibious vehicle ever built became too expensive to survive, the story has to start 30 years earlier, with a battlefield problem no existing machine could solve. In 1972, the United States Marine Corps fielded a vehicle called the AAV-7. It was the standard by which every amphibious assault was measured. It could carry Marines from a ship to a beach, and for a decade, that was enough. Then the math of naval warfare changed. Anti-ship missiles grew faster, cheaper, and easier to acquire. Sea mines became smarter, capable of sitting silent on the ocean floor for years, waiting for a hull to pass overhead. By the early 1980s, Pentagon planners looked at a map of any contested coastline and reached the same uncomfortable conclusion. The ships that carried Marines to war could no longer safely approach the shore they were supposed to attack. The old doctrine had called for landing ships to close to within a few miles of the beach before troops went ashore. That distance was now a kill zone. A single missile battery, hidden in the hills above a landing site, could sink an amphibious assault ship before a single Marine set foot on sand. The AAV-7 made the problem worse, not better. It was slow in the water, barely faster than a man could swim, which meant that even if a ship survived the approach, the vehicles launched from it would spend agonizing minutes crawling across open water in full view of coastal defenses. Every naval planner understood this. It was not a secret weakness. It was the accepted cost of amphibious warfare, the way flooded trenches had once been the accepted cost of the First World War. Out of this problem came a new doctrine, one that would define Marine Corps thinking for the next 3 decades. Operational maneuver from the sea. Ships would no longer creep close to shore. They would launch their assault from over the horizon, 25 nautical miles out, beyond the range of most coastal defenses, invisible from the beach itself. It was a doctrine that solved one problem by creating another. 25 miles of open ocean is not a short swim. No existing vehicle in the American arsenal could cross that distance quickly enough to matter. A slow vehicle launched from safety would simply spend more time exposed, crawling across the water for the better part of an hour while an entire invasion force sat vulnerable behind it. By the mid-1980s, this was simply understood as fact inside the Marine Corps. The ships could retreat to safety, but the vehicles that left them could not follow. Speed across open water was not a luxury. It was the only variable that made the entire doctrine survivable. No existing machine could deliver it. Every amphibious vehicle in the world moved through water the way a swimmer moves, pushing displaced water aside, fighting drag with every foot traveled. To cross 25 miles fast enough to matter, something would have to move differently. Something would have to rise up and skim across the surface instead of pushing through it. That idea did not yet have a name, a budget, or a company behind it. In 1988, it did not even have a shape. It existed only as a requirement on a piece of paper at Marine Corps headquarters, a demand that sounded, to most naval engineers who read it, less like an achievable specification and more like a physical impossibility. In 1988, the Marine Corps formally launched a program to solve the problem. They called it the Advanced Amphibious Assault Vehicle, AAAV. The name was bureaucratic and forgettable. The requirements behind it were not. The specification demanded a vehicle that could do two contradictory things at the highest level ever attempted. In water, it needed to plane across the surface at speeds approaching 30 miles per hour, fast enough to cross 25 nautical miles in under an hour, fast enough to make the over-the-horizon doctrine survivable. On land, once it reached the beach, it needed to keep pace with the fastest vehicle in the American armored fleet, the M1 Abrams tank, capable of over 40 miles per hour across open terrain. No vehicle in military history had ever been asked to do both. Tanks were built heavy, low, and built to absorb punishment. Their weight was the point. Fast boats were built light and hydrodynamic, shaped to slice through water with minimal resistance. Every design principle that made a vehicle good at one job actively worked against it in the other. A hull heavy enough to survive combat on land would sink like a brick in the water. A hull light enough to skim across the ocean would shred under enemy fire on the beach. For nearly a decade, the requirement sat largely on paper while the Marine Corps searched for a contractor willing to attempt it. In 1996, General Dynamics Land Systems won the development contract. General Dynamics was not a newcomer chasing a novelty project. The company had built the M1 Abrams itself, the same tank the new amphibious vehicle was expected to match on land. It had decades of experience in armored vehicle design, ceramic armor systems, and heavy vehicle propulsion. If any company in America had the engineering pedigree to attempt a vehicle that behaved like a boat and a tank in the same afternoon, it was this one. The contract set the terms of a program that would eventually stretch across 3 decades. The Marine Corps wanted 1,025 vehicles. The projected price tag at the outset was $8.5 billion for the full fleet, a number that worked out to roughly $8 million per vehicle, expensive for a troop carrier but not unreasonable for a machine expected to do the impossible. What the contract could not specify was how many separate engineering problems that single requirement would eventually generate. A planing hull needed hydraulic panels that could deploy in seconds and retract into a smooth, low-drag shape without a single vulnerable seam for a bullet to find. The power plant needed to switch between 2 entirely different jobs, a high-output mode to lift and drive the vehicle across the ocean surface, and a completely different low-output mode to crawl across broken terrain without failing at the transition. The electronics, the suspension, the armor, the weapon systems, every single subsystem on the vehicle would eventually need its own dual-mode solution because nothing on a conventional amphibious vehicle or a conventional tank could simply be borrowed and installed. At the moment the ink dried on the 1996 contract, none of that complexity was visible yet. What existed was a signature, a set of performance targets, and a company confident enough in its own engineering to accept them. The clock on the AAAV program had started. It would not stop for 15 years. General Dynamics engineers solved the contradiction with a single mechanical idea. The vehicle would not fight the water. It would rise above it. The hull was built with a hydraulically actuated bow flap, a folding panel at the front of the vehicle that stayed retracted on land, tucked flush against the armor. In the water, the flap deployed forward and locked into place, transforming the vehicle's nose into a wedge-shaped planing surface. As the vehicle accelerated, that wedge did exactly what it was designed to do. It lifted the 36-ton hull up and out of the water, letting it skim across the surface the way a speedboat rides its own wake instead of plowing through it. This single mechanism was the difference between a troop carrier and the fastest amphibious vehicle ever built. Behind the hull sat the second half of the solution, a custom MTU Friedrichshafen diesel engine, designated the MT-883, engineered to run in 2 distinct modes. On land, it operated as a conventional high-torque diesel, pushing the vehicle across broken terrain with the same cross-country agility the Marine Corps had demanded from an Abrams tank. In the water, the engine shifted into a high-power planing mode, redirecting its output through water jet propulsion to drive the hull up onto its own bow wave and hold it there. No amphibious vehicle before it had ever asked a single power plant to serve 2 such different masters, a beast of burden on land, a speedboat engine at sea, and switch between them in the middle of an assault. The results when they came justified the decade of engineering. In testing, the vehicle reached water speeds of roughly 29 miles per hour, nearly 3 times faster than the AAV-7 it was built to replace. On land, It matched the cross-country mobility the Marine Corps had originally specified against the M1 Abrams. It carried a crew of 3 and 17 fully equipped Marines, more than any comparable vehicle in the American arsenal, protected by composite armor built from ceramic panels, S2 fiberglass, and a Kevlar-like woven fabric layered to stop machine gun fire and artillery fragments alike. It was also, structurally, something new. The vehicle used a space-frame chassis, a lightweight internal skeleton more commonly associated with high-performance automobiles than 36-ton armored vehicles, making it the first heavy tactical vehicle in American military history built this way. Every choice existed for the same reason: shave weight without sacrificing survivability, because in this vehicle, weight was the enemy of the entire mission profile. In 2003, the program was renamed. Advanced Amphibious Assault Vehicle became the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, EFV, a name meant to signal that this was no longer an experimental concept but a program approaching production. On paper, the achievement was real and measurable. A vehicle that could launch from a ship over the horizon, cross 25 miles of open ocean at nearly 30 miles an hour, then fight across land at a pace that matched America's primary battle tank, was not a theoretical improvement. It was, by every performance metric the Marine Corps had specified 15 years earlier, exactly what they had asked for. What the test results could not yet show was what it would cost to keep that machine running in the field, day after day, outside the controlled conditions of a proving ground, and how many of those elegant dual-mode systems, so effective in isolation, would begin to fail once they had to work together, under strain, for months at a time. That question would not be answered on a test range. It would be answered in 2006 in front of Marine Corps inspectors whose job was not to admire the engineering, but to ask whether it would still be running a year after delivery. By the mid-2000s, the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle was no longer just a development contract. It was the centerpiece of the Marine Corps' entire ground modernization strategy. Every service branch ranks its acquisition priorities, and for years the EFV sat at the very top of that list, ahead of new rifles, ahead of communications upgrades, ahead of nearly every other ground system competing for the same finite defense budget. Marine Corps leadership described it, publicly and repeatedly, as the #1 priority ground weapon system in the entire service. That designation was not a marketing phrase. It shaped how the Pentagon allocated money for more than a decade, protecting the program's funding even as other initiatives were trimmed or delayed. The reasoning was straightforward. The AAV-7 that Marines still relied on had entered service in 1972. By 2005, it was over 30 years old, built for a doctrine of close-in assault that naval planners had already concluded was obsolete. Every year the EFV slipped. The Marine Corps was left relying on a vehicle its own strategists considered dangerously outdated for the threats it now faced. The urgency was real, and it was institutional, not just budgetary. It was the difference between a doctrine that worked on paper and one that could actually survive contact with a modern coastline defended by missiles and mines. The dollar figures scaled to match that urgency. The Marine Corps' full requirement called for 1,025 vehicles. Program funding grew accordingly, moving from an initial research budget into a full-rate production plan projected to cost in the billions. Congress, largely persuaded by the strategic case, kept appropriating money. Reporting from that period consistently described the EFV in the same terms: essential, overdue, and too important to abandon. Inside General Dynamics, the program justified an expanding investment in specialized manufacturing capability, tooling, testing facilities, and a supply chain built specifically around the vehicle's unusual dual-mode systems. This was not a side project the company could walk away from without consequence. It was a flagship contract, tied to the company's broader identity as the leading builder of American armored vehicles. The expectation, shared across the Pentagon, Congress, and the Marine Corps itself, was that the EFV would become the backbone of American amphibious warfare for the next generation. The vehicle that would carry Marines ashore in every major contingency planning document written for the next 30 years. It was spoken of less as a procurement program and more as a foregone conclusion, a piece of the future already decided. That confidence rested on a specific kind of evidence: engineering test results, performance benchmarks, speed trials on calm water and controlled terrain. What it had not yet been tested against was the far less forgiving standard the Marine Corps was about to apply, not whether the vehicle could perform once under ideal conditions, but whether it could perform reliably, day after day, the way an actual combat vehicle would need to. In 2006, that test finally came, and the vehicle that had spent a decade being described as essential, overdue, and unstoppable was about to be described for the first time in a very different set of words. In 2006, the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle underwent its first major operational assessment, the test that mattered most, because it moved the vehicle out of the controlled environment of a proving ground and into something closer to how Marines would actually use it. The results were not close to what 15 years of development had promised. Prototype vehicles broke down repeatedly during testing, often after only a few hours of continuous operation. Government investigators later documented the pattern in stark terms. The EFV was falling far short of its reliability targets, failing at a rate that made sustained field use effectively impossible. A vehicle built to carry 17 Marines across 25 miles of open ocean and then fight across a beachhead was, in practice, struggling to complete a single test cycle without a critical system failing. The cause was not one broken part. It was the same complexity that had made the vehicle's original achievement so remarkable. Every dual-mode system that had impressed engineers in isolation, the hydraulic bow flap, the two-mode diesel engine, the electronics built to function both underwater and on dry terrain, now had to work in combination, under repeated stress, without the careful calibration of a test range. A hydraulic seal that performed perfectly in a single demonstration might fail after the 40th transition between water mode and land mode. An electronic suite engineered for two entirely different operating environments multiplied the number of points where something could go wrong, and in sustained testing, those points kept finding ways to fail. The Government Accountability Office reviewed the results and reached a blunt conclusion. The program had encountered serious difficulties in design demonstration and now faced significant risk going forward. This was not the language of a program experiencing minor delays. It was the language used to describe a program in genuine trouble. For the Marine Corps, the assessment created an immediate and uncomfortable choice. The vehicle that had been described for a decade as the essential future of amphibious warfare had just failed the test, designed to prove it was ready for exactly that role. Canceling the program outright, after 18 years and billions already committed, was not a decision anyone wanted to make. But continuing forward with a vehicle this unreliable was not a serious option either. What emerged from that dilemma was not cancellation, and it was not confidence. It was a decision to start over, to send General Dynamics back to redesign the vehicle's core systems from the ground up, in the hope that a second attempt at solving the same engineering problem could succeed where the first had fallen short. That decision would come with a price tag no one in 1988 had imagined, and a number that, once it reached Congress, would trigger a legal mechanism specifically designed to stop runaway defense programs in their tracks. In American defense acquisition, there is a legal tripwire built specifically to catch programs like this one. It is called a Nunn-McCurdy breach, and it activates automatically whenever a weapons program's per-unit cost grows past a fixed threshold. A mechanism written into law after decades of watching military programs quietly balloon in price with no one forced to explain why. In 2007, the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle tripped that wire. The math was impossible to soften. The per-unit cost of the EFV had climbed from an original estimate of roughly $6 million to $17 million, nearly triple the figure Congress had been told to expect. By some later accountings, as the program continued, that number would climb even further, past $20 million per vehicle. One member of Congress, reviewing the numbers at a hearing on the program, stated plainly that the growth would likely make the EFV the most expensive ground combat vehicle in the history of the United States military. The breach forced a mandatory review, conducted at the level of the Secretary of Defense, with a binary outcome: certify that the program was still worth continuing, or kill it. In 2007, the review chose to certify it, but not without extracting a cost that would prove nearly as damaging as cancellation itself. The Marine Corps and General Dynamics agreed to something almost unheard of in a program already 18 years old. They would not patch the existing design. They would repeat the entire system's development and demonstration phase from the beginning. In March 2007, the Marine Corps modified the contract and awarded General Dynamics an additional $143.5 million specifically to redesign the vehicle's failing systems. Analysts covering defense acquisition at the time did not mince words about what this meant. It was described as the largest program setback in memory, a decision that erased years of progress and reset the clock on a project already approaching 2 decades old. The original development phase had been scheduled for completion in 2003. The restarted version would not be finished until 2011. 8 full years behind the timeline the Marine Corps had promised Congress at the outset. For General Dynamics, the redesign was both an opportunity and an indictment. It was a chance to fix what testing had exposed, but it was also an admission, backed by a 9-figure contract, that the vehicle fielded in 2006 had not been close to ready. 7 new prototypes were ordered, their electronics rewired from the ground up, their reliability problems targeted system by system in a process that would consume another 4 years and hundreds of millions of additional dollars. The program survived 2007, but it survived on borrowed time, carrying a price tag that now made it politically radioactive and a schedule that pushed its promised delivery date further into a future where the entire fiscal environment around American defense spending was about to change beyond recognition. In August 2008, the Marine Corps and General Dynamics signed the contract for a second systems development and demonstration phase. SDD-2, the formal name for the do-over that had been ordered the year before. Work on 7 new prototypes began in January 2009, with rewired electronics and redesigned components intended to fix the failures the 2006 assessment had exposed. The engineering, on its own terms, was not the problem this time. The problem was the world the program now had to survive in. By 2008, the United States was fighting 2 wars simultaneously, and the financial crisis that began that same year gutted the assumptions behind every long-term federal budget in Washington. Defense spending, which had grown steadily through most of the EFV's development, was entering an era of contraction. Programs that had been untouchable in 1996 were now competing for survival against a shrinking pool of money and a growing list of wartime obligations that could not be deferred. The EFV's own numbers made it an easy target inside that shrinking budget. The total program cost, once projected at $8.5 billion for over 1,000 vehicles, had grown to a projected $15 billion, and that estimate now covered a smaller fleet than originally planned. $3 billion of that money had already been spent, with no vehicle yet in service. To anyone reviewing the federal budget with an eye toward cuts, the EFV was no longer described as an essential modernization program. It was described as a cautionary tale. That description started coming from unexpected places. In 2010, the U.S. Public Interest Research Group and the National Taxpayers Union, 2 organizations that rarely found common ground on anything, issued a joint report naming the EFV, alongside the F-35 fighter jet and the V-22 Osprey, as an example of wasteful defense spending that should be canceled outright. That same year, the co-chairs of the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, tasked by the White House with finding ways to close the federal deficit, singled out the EFV by name as a program that should be cut. The vehicle had not gotten less capable. If anything, the redesigned prototypes moving through testing in 2009 and 2010 were closer to solving the reliability problems than any earlier version had been. What had changed was the context around it. A program that could be justified in 1996 when defense budgets were expanding and the threat picture felt distant was much harder to justify in 2010 in a Washington consumed by deficit anxiety and war-weary budget math. Inside the Pentagon, the pressure was compounding from 2 directions at once. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates had already spent much of 2009 and 2010 publicly hunting for major weapons programs to cut, arguing that the Department of Defense needed to demonstrate fiscal discipline before Congress imposed it from outside. And the EFV, with its history of cost breaches, its 8-year schedule slip, and its ballooning $15 billion price tag, was exactly the kind of program his search was designed to find. By the final months of 2010, the question inside the Pentagon was no longer whether the EFV could eventually be made to work. The engineers largely believed it could. The question was whether, in the budget environment of 2011, anyone with the authority to keep funding it would still be willing to try. On January 6, 2011, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates stood before reporters at the Pentagon to announce a series of budget efficiencies and reinvestment decisions. Buried inside that briefing was the sentence that ended the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle. Gates stated that he agreed with the recommendation of the Secretary of the Navy and the Commandant of the Marine Corps to cancel the program. He described the vehicle bluntly: an 80,000-pound armored machine built to skim the surface of the ocean at high speed before transitioning into land combat, a description that, stripped of any technical admiration, sounded less like a triumph of engineering and more like an explanation of exactly why the vehicle had become so difficult and expensive to build. What made the moment different from a routine budget cut was who stood beside the decision. A week later, at a speech to the Surface Navy Association, Commandant of the Marine Corps General James Amos addressed the cancellation directly. He did not frame it as a defeat imposed from outside. He framed it as a conclusion his own service had reached. Despite the best efforts of all involved, Amos said, the EFV program has become too onerous. Thus, I recommended to the Secretary of Defense to cancel it. This was the detail that separated the EFV's ending from an ordinary program cut. The Marine Corps had spent nearly a decade calling this vehicle its #1 ground acquisition priority. The same institution that had defended the program through a Nunn-McCurdy breach, through an 8-year schedule slip, through a complete restart of its development phase, was now the one asking for its own flagship program to be killed. Amos was careful to draw a distinction that mattered enormously to the Marines who would still need a way to get from ship to shore. The cancellation, he insisted, was not a rejection of the amphibious assault mission itself. I remain committed to develop and field an effective, survivable, and affordable new amphibious vehicle, he said, sooner rather than later. The number attached to the decision was almost too clean in its brutality. 27 years of development, $3 billion spent, 0 vehicles delivered to a single Marine Corps unit. The program that had once been projected to cost $8.5 billion for over 1,000 vehicles was terminated on a trajectory toward $15 billion for a fraction of that number. Cancelled not because the engineering had ultimately failed, but because the cost of finishing it could no longer be justified against everything else competing for the same shrinking budget. For General Dynamics, the announcement meant the end of the company's flagship vehicle program, one built around specialized manufacturing capability the company had invested in for over a decade. For the Marine Corps, it meant returning to a vehicle, the AAV-7, that had entered service in 1972, nearly 40 years earlier, still waiting for the replacement it had been promised since the Reagan administration. The cancellation was announced in a single sentence inside a broader budget briefing. What it left behind? A capability gap, a sunk cost of $3 billion, and a Marine Corps that still needed an answer to the exact problem the EFV had been built to solve would take considerably longer to resolve. The Marine Corps did not wait long to move on. A little more than a month after Gates announced the cancellation, the service launched a new competition, first called the New Amphibious Vehicle, then renamed the Amphibious Combat Vehicle, or ACV. The philosophy behind it was a direct rejection of everything the EFV had tried to prove. Where the EFV had chased the most demanding performance specification the Marine Corps had ever written, high-speed planing across open ocean, cross-country agility to match a main battle tank, the ACV program was built around a different set of priorities entirely: reliability, affordability, and a schedule the Marine Corps could actually believe in. Alongside it, the Marine Corps also pursued a companion program, the Marine Personnel Carrier, which would later be folded into the ACV effort as an early phase of the same broader replacement strategy. The contrast extended to who would build it. General Dynamics, the company that had spent 15 years and roughly $3 billion trying to solve the EFV's engineering puzzle, did not walk away with the replacement contract. That contract eventually went to BAE Systems, a rival defense contractor, working with Italian firm Iveco on a vehicle design already in service with several NATO allies, rather than one built from scratch around an unprecedented performance target. The decision was, in effect, a verdict on the entire EFV approach. Rather than demand a machine capable of skimming across the ocean at speeds no armored vehicle had ever reached. The ACV specification asked for something far more modest in water. Enough amphibious capability to get Marines from ship to shore, built on a wheeled platform already proven reliable in years of real-world use elsewhere. The Marine Corps had spent 27 years chasing the most ambitious version of the problem. It replaced that pursuit with the least ambitious version that could still plausibly work. What remained of the EFV program itself was almost nothing. $3 billion in research and development, 7 redesigned prototypes, a decade and a half of specialized manufacturing investment inside General Dynamics. None of it produced a single vehicle that entered service with a Marine Corps unit. The engineering knowledge generated by the program did not vanish entirely. Elements of its testing and lessons learned informed later requirements documents. But no EFV hull, no EFV engine, no piece of the vehicle itself would ever carry a Marine into combat. The AAV-7, the aging 1972 vehicle the EFV had been designed to replace, remained in frontline service for years after the cancellation, kept alive through incremental upgrades to its engines, electronics, and armament, while the Marine Corps waited for its actual replacement to arrive. The vehicle that was supposed to be retired in the early 2000s was, by the program's own cancellation date, already approaching its 40th year of service, still standing in for a machine that had never made it past the prototype stage. The amphibious combat vehicle finally began entering Marine Corps service in the early 2020s, nearly 50 years after the AAV-7 it replaced had first rolled off the production line, and more than 3 decades after the Marine Corps first identified the doctrinal problem the EFV was meant to solve. The vehicle that finally answered that 1988 requirement bore almost no resemblance to the one originally built to meet it. The ACV does not plane across the ocean surface at 30 miles an hour. It does not match an Abrams tank stride for stride across open terrain. It solves a smaller, more modest version of the same problem. Enough amphibious capability to get Marines ashore, built on a design already proven reliable elsewhere, purchased from a company that had never touched the EFV program at all. In the most literal sense, the requirement survived. Almost nothing else about the original vehicle did. Judged purely on engineering ambition, the EFV was not a failure. Its planing hull worked. Its dual-mode engine worked. In testing, it achieved water speeds nearly 3 times faster than anything the Marine Corps had fielded before, while carrying more Marines than any comparable vehicle in the American arsenal. The performance specifications written in 1988 were, by the numbers, largely met. What the program could never solve was the question underneath the engineering: whether a machine this complex could be built reliably enough and cheaply enough to survive contact with a defense budget that had far less patience in 2011 than it had in 1996. That is the distinction the EFV story leaves behind, sharper than almost any other program of its era. It did not die because the physics failed. It died because the accounting did, because a vehicle asked to be simultaneously the fastest thing in the water and the toughest thing on land, generated a bill that grew faster than any institution could keep defending it, year after year, hearing after hearing, until the same Marine Corps that had once called it essential stood up and asked for its own priority program to be buried. The Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle was built to solve the deadliest gap in American amphibious warfare, the 25 miles of open water between a ship and a beach. It never crossed that gap in service. The gap it could not cross in the end was the one between what it could do and what it cost to keep doing it.